guys, welcome back to the channel. So today we're doing things a little differently, guys. We are gonna go back in time a little bit to the Renaissance, to a classical age of thinking, okay, to the ancients a little bit. Really what we're gonna do is actually incorporate a school of thought, particularly the School of Athens. I was inspired to study or go back to some of the teachings of the classical philosophers that I used to study growing up and that I also studied some in college. And I'm here to really kind of translate today, I feel a message coming through of how it all connects together. As you can see, we have the great philosophers here. And what I'm going to do is actually take you on a story, a personal journey of mine through the photo of the School of Athens. And then I'm going to, depending on how long this reading gets, you may see this broken up into 12 different videos for the zodiac signs. So a message from each philosopher to each of the zodiac signs. And we'll see what message comes through and how it translates and if we can make sense of it and all that. I'm hoping we can. But if this portion gets a little long, then I will cut the video up into different sections. Okay? So without further ado, let's take a deep dive into the School of Athens. So we're here. This fresco painted by Raphael let me double check here. Raphael Sanzio. Yes. So why is this painting so important to me? First of all, I grew up with it. It was literally the mural hanging up in my school building when I was a child, and I actually went to Rome and saw it in person here back in 2015. This was about 10 years ago, and I finally got to see this fresco and painting, and it's in person, I should say, and it's just as captivating there as it always has been. It has even deeper significance to me now based on, because I think why now is actually what I've been trying to uncover. Why is this painting really speaking to me now? For me, it actually marks a 10-year cycle, being that this is the year of 2025. After I went to Italy and to Rome specifically and to the Vatican and I saw this photo, it seems that a lot of things from that year actually transpired. I had significant life events that happened to me that year. Probably, I would say, even the start of my Saturn return. So it's interesting for me that this image, this painting has now come full circle. This is actually now my personal copy of the School of Athens, the Scala d'Atenia, or School of Athens, right? Athens, of course, is dedicated to the goddess Athena, and here we have, I used to think this was Athena, but actually it is, I believe, the goddess Minerva, which is also a goddess, who is also a goddess of wisdom, and I want to say this is... who is this? It's not Hermes. I can look at the portrait. Some of the... well, it's not important now. Let me get... before I lose my train of thought, I'll get into it. There's a lot of symbolism, particularly in this fresco. Not just the significance of the fresco itself, and also the history behind how it was painted, where it was painted, specifically in the Vatican. This would be the door that you come through, and the fresco would be here. This was the Pope's chambers, the Pope at the time. This would have been his official chamber. Oh gosh, we're going down some dark stuff now. Not dark, there's so much history to specifically this one photo. Aside from the philosophers themselves who are all depicted here, this is, of course, again depicting classical philosophy, classical scholars, many of whom you would recognize, or hopefully recognize, would be at the center of focus here, would be Plato on the left, Aristotle on the right. We have other known figures here such as Pythagoras. These would have been his understudies, or people, schools of thought that would have come after him or followed his same method of teaching. This one here specifically would have been Averroes or Ibn Rushd. Ibn Rushd, who I believe was Arabic, who actually first, I think, developed the cure or vaccination for smallpox later. This would have been much later, of course, but he would have studied under Pythagoras. This here would be Heraclitus, who is marked, actually a rendition of Michelangelo. Both of, I think, Raphael and Michelangelo were commissioned at the same time, or roughly around the same time, to work on these frescoes, or within the same decade, I do believe. But Raphael, as we know, frescoes get changed. Raphael would have not have finished his fresco at the time, so Michelangelo got commissioned to paint Heraclitus, but he actually painted him kind of looking like himself, and you can kind of tell that Heraclitus, that the way he's positioned, even in the fresco, is obscure. It's obtuse to the flow of the actual painting itself, whereas all the lines of this fresco seem to be going, of course, left to right. Everything is symmetrical, identical. All of a sudden we have Heraclitus here who's kind of an obstruction to the viewer, an obstruction to the view. He sticks out like a sore thumb, and his lines are going in an obscure way against the natural flow of this fresco. I think Michelangelo did that on purpose, because he and Raphael either didn't like each other or whatever the case may be. Speaking of Raphael, he is here next to his his mentor, Sodoma. Raphael is featured here with Sodoma. Now, what actually caused me to even look at this fresco again, and interestingly enough, how this piece came back into my possession just recently, was this man here, Zoroaster. Zoroaster holding a nebula, holding basically a globe, a nebulous globe here in his hand, next to Ptolemy holding the figure of the globe, of the world, here in his hand. Both of these figures would have been together under a school of thought. And here we have Raphael, Sodoma, Ptolemy, and Zoroaster, all kind of in the same school of thought over here. Okay, you'll notice all the figures are kind of in their own little schools of thought. You might even notice this particular set of scholars, which would have been featured on a famous rock and roll cover, I want to say. I don't remember which one, but these two figures here you have seen depicted on a famous rock and roll cover. If you know the one, go ahead and tag it below. But anyway, what I want to focus on is Raphael. At the time when this was taking place, or when this fresco would have been depicted, first of all, the idea was the School of Athens. There was no actual school, right? There was no actual school in Athens dedicated to these philosophers, because all of these philosophers lived at different times, of course. The idea is the train of thought. It's a school of thought that was encapsulated here under Athena, the goddess of wisdom, right? The goddess of wisdom and war, technically. So under the veil of Athena, we have encapsulated this school of classical thought, literature, and during the Age of Reason, captured and depicted during the Age of Reason. Okay, sorry for the history lesson, guys, but this is literally, it's all coming back to me now, and I'm just channeling it for the history of it, right? For the history of understanding this fresco. Why is it important? Again, I want to pull back to Zoroaster for just a second over here. Zoroaster, we pulled the card in our last reading, if you remember, of the ancient sites, the Zoroastrian temple, as a matter of fact, which was about a rebirth through fire. That the collective was undergoing a rebirth through fire. And it was about stepping outside of our comfort zones and maybe doing things that we've never done before. It's a phoenix rising moment, kind of. And he's holding again a nebula of the stars of the cosmos here in his hand. And it's about, and as we know in the Tarot Society and in the spiritual society, we know that constellations represent schools of thought, of ancestry that are beyond this solar system, that are beyond maybe even this galaxy. We're talking about schools of awareness, a school of awareness, of thought, of consciousness, of the universe that has been around for ages and ages and ages. That civilization upon civilization, dynasty upon dynasty, world upon world, planet, etc. We've all undergone these life lessons. We're all defining each other, defining ourselves within such a universe. And we do it over and over and over and over again. Now, what's interesting about the School of Athens, particularly, I think the most notable thing, one of the two things, classical historians would probably not like me to depict this, and I don't know, maybe classical philosophers and classical historians would not necessarily agree to depict this, or where does it tie? Where would a fresco like this tie in with what we do here necessarily? Well, as we know, art was the avenue, the mediumship through which many classic philosophers and artists at the time used to convey messages to the people. They used art in a form to convey messages for future generations, and we know this through specifically Leonardo da Vinci's work. Speaking of Leonardo da Vinci, Plato here is actually inspired. Raphael was inspired by Leonardo da Vinci to depict him as Plato. So this is actually basically a depiction of Leonardo da Vinci as Plato within Raphael's school. Aristotle, I'm not actually sure who the representation of the likeness is supposed to imitate, but I'm sure a known figure at the time would have been relevant to Raphael. There are many websites, including the original website that I grew up on, that was a part of the school that I went to, that talks about the philosophers, and you can actually click on each one here and get a bit of history on them. But again, back to the painting, back to the fresco itself. Why relate such a document to what we do here? I think, as most people in the spiritual community do, we're out to prove that all of this actually kind of coexists with each other, as Leonardo da Vinci himself did in so many of his works that aren't even public. In fact, again, like so many of these works that we only have a handful of information to even understand what these philosophers were about. We only have very few selective works by these individuals, by these artists, by these great minds. And it's important that we keep their train of thought together. It's important that we always understand our roots. where schools of thought come from, why we do what we do. There's reason, and especially art is the number one thing that depicts that. Us as fellow tarot readers, I might be speaking, this might be just a good history lesson for many of us out there, or just a recap, I would say. And if you study classical art and classical, obviously, philosophy and everything, you will appreciate this. You really will. I know you will. Because you can already see some of the things as I'm depicting out. Where does this, you would say, even tie into Hermeticism, what we study here, spirituality, all of that. While these individual figures are arguing and discussing the very philosophies and the things that we are teaching across the world on YouTube, free to the public, right? When we come online and we dig into psychology, the development, the tarot, and we divinate, okay? I see it as partially paying homage to these great, to not only my personal wisdom and mediumship and my ability to work with the divine, but it's also, I like to think now, looking back at this fresco, it's paying homage to all these people who came before. These are real people, real men, and believe it or not, a woman here. Her name is Hypatia of Alexandria. And here she's depicted actually as a boy because women were not allowed to be painted in frescoes, right? Women were not allowed to be depicted in art at this time. So she's actually the only female philosopher even depicted in this time. And here's something cool. In this fresco, she, as well as Raphael, are the only two figures faced out to the future. When we study art, guys, we know what that means. When you have two faces faced out to the future, spaced out to the audience, I should say, it's exactly what I just said. It's basically these two are speaking to the future. If it were not for Raphael and Hypatia, we would know zero to nothing about any of these ancient philosophers that you see here, these classical foot figures. Because Hypatia is actually responsible for saving the scrolls that were burned in several of the burnings of the Library of Alexandria. But she's responsible for much of the knowledge that was preserved, that we have even knowledge of these figures. It was due to her. She was a philosopher herself, as well as a mathematician. In fact, it's not common knowledge, but she actually theorized heliocentrism before Galileo did. Her works. And Rachel Weisz, I do believe, depicted her in a movie called Hypatia, several years ago. But yeah, if it were not for her and for him, we would know nothing about these people. And it's paying homage to the little information that we do have, and where does it come from? And then the rivalry. What is this ultimately saying? A school of thought. It's a message to the future, right? Because that's what these artists did. And where is the nod to Hermeticism in much of this? Well, is it depicted on the walls here of the School of Athens, or what could it be? This would just represent the temple itself, because statues obviously did at the time. But this is a wisdom represented on the right-hand side. And which is interesting, is to say that these artists knew, as Da Vinci would have known, these artists knew where knowledge comes from. A classical understanding of Leonardo and Aristotle would say that Plato would argue that all knowledge comes from the heavens, right? Pointing up above. Whereas Aristotle would say that no, all knowledge really comes from the earth. It comes from our surroundings. It is observable in reality, that where we can derive knowledge from. Really, it's both, but these would have been the classic arguments between the two, right? But here's where we see something very peculiar, and I know my tarot readers will appreciate this, my readers in general, or if you're studying, is the nod to Hermeticism. Where we think we should see it, it is literally dead center right here between these two. What is between not only their posture, their hand gestures, and what they're talking about? Because as we know, Plato is positioning as above with his finger pointed up, and Aristotle is basically nodding, saying so below with his right hand. Both these figures use their right hand to do this, the masculine, okay? And they hold knowledge, the books, which we see in the high priestess, right, which would be the Torah. This is a knowledge of a school of Aristotle's thought. This would be the school of Plato's thought, both coming together to talk about these perceptions, right? We see the nod to Hermeticism and moral principles with these two figures here, saying as above, and Aristotle basically saying so below, pointing down at the earth, is really where this ties into spirituality. Not only that, but let's talk about their clothing, the colors of their clothes, the robes that they're wearing. Plato, in deep red, would represent the masculine, right? The masculine here. Whereas Aristotle, on the right hand side to the viewer, but the left hand side of them approaching, which would be the feminine, which blue would represent intuition, right? The intuition of, like the high priestess, we normally see her featured in a blue tunic, right? We see where color now comes into play with the choosing of color to tell us what these symbols mean and what each person, each philosopher in here could have represented just based on the tunic of what they wore. Everyone who would have maybe followed on Aristotle's side of the map, or on obviously the right side for the viewer, left side of the painting, right? We would call this in theater, we would call this stage, what it would be, stage right, yeah, or stage left. And then for Plato, all of the students on his side would be over here, yeah, or similar thoughts, right? Not necessarily. Some are below. The lower decks, like down stage, would represent the future, right? Future generations, because they're closer to the audience, and those further away would represent past, further back philosophers, more ancient ideologies from the past, because they're farther away from the audience. Okay? Just another way to interpret art, classic art, or art, and even as you read your tarot. Okay, we're almost 24 minutes in. Wow, so there's so much here that I don't want to take the time all the time to just talk here. I would literally have to go in deeper with each one. But this, I guess I want to end this by saying, recapping what I understood, why I believe, again, this piece has come back into my life at such a time, is not just for me personally closing out a huge cycle of my life, and something in, I want to say, Sagittarius is going on position astrologically in Sagittarius, which again rules the 9th house, which is about education, philosophy, teaching, learning, our values, our beliefs, our ethics and principles. And it's important, I think, that we remember, or at least have an idea of what those are, especially when we divinate, when we do what we do here, You know what I mean? There's a reason we need to have some sort of formal... Well, I'm not here to tell you how to do your practice. Please don't think of me preaching to you that way, and I never would, by the way. All I'm suggesting here is that for me personally, there's a reason we have a system of beliefs and values that help guide our moral and ethical thought as well as our practices. And you need to have moral authority in what you do. And when I say moral authority, it means practice what you preach. In other words, if you're doing something like this, you need to know why. If you're teaching, you need to know why. And if you're wanting to understand the deeper semblance and significance and the wider significance of certain things, just appreciate that the fact that we do what we do wouldn't even be possible without the figures that you see depicted here. Many of them. Mostly her. Mostly Hypatia. For me, anyway. So it's just kind of a nod to knowing that when you have a wider appreciation, it just gives you a wider appreciation of what you do. You know what I mean? So I think that's all I really wanted to say. I'm just so appreciative that this picture came back into my life, and I have my own copy now, and it spoke to me from a very long time ago, of my childhood, early learning years, and I'm just really happy to have it again, and I wanted to share that. And I'm learning new things now. I can appreciate it even more as an adult looking at this than what I even knew as a child. So I could really dive deep into this. And so for now, I think we're going to jump into the zodiac. I'm going to look at each of you one by one, and we're going to get a message from the philosopher that could depict each zodiac sign for now. Not like you're limited to one, but you know, just for fun, for funsies, okay? Guys, I hope you enjoyed this mini micro telling of the School of Athens, right? Painted by Raphael Sanzio. Yes. Okay. I will see you, if you don't see it below, I will see you at your individual sign in either below or next or individually in other individual readings, etc. etc. Thank you guys for chilling with me and coming along this journey of the great philosophers, and see you soon.